Hello, my name is Sebastián Vaelnzuela. I'm an associate professor in the School of Communications at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and I'm going to be presenting the results of the work I've been doing for the past 2-3 years with my research team here in Chile on the effects of misinformation on people's attitudes and behaviors. The title of my presentation is called Maximal Panic, Minimal Consequences, Studying the Effects of Only Misinformation on Attitudes and Behavior. Again, many thanks for inviting me to present here in the Congress, and I'm happy to keep the conversation after this presentation through email, and there's my contact information also on Twitter. Misinformation, it's the scholarly term to the concept that most people describe as fake news, right? That's the term that journalists and people colloquially use to refer to the phenomenon of misinformation. Not surprisingly, this term became very popular after the 2016 elections in the US and the referendum in the UK on Brexit. Here I'm showing the result of Google Trends data on the popularity of the concept fake news. And as you can see, after 2016, or during 2016 and onwards, this interest has spiked over time with some ebbs and flows. But basically before then, it was not that fake news didn't exist. It was just that it garnered less of an attention. Now, as it usually happens in communication, big phenomena that are related to the news become, again, big phenomena in terms of research interest for communication scholars. And we are no exception. After 2016, the literature and the scientific literature on fake news and misinformation exploded, just as it had exploded the popularity of the term among policymakers, journalists, and the public. And not being an exception, of course, also in Chile, where I'm located, the phenomenon became interesting. So just to give you some background on why is it that it's relevant to study misinformation, for one thing, it's a problem that substantive groups of people around the world have been suggesting that it's a concern. Here I'm showing you data from the Digital News Report from the Reuters Institute that polls groups in many different countries, internet users, on topics from social media to news media to misinformation and so forth. And as you can see, in countries all over the world, fake news and the concerns about being exposed to fabricated content online, it's pretty big, right? From a scholarly perspective, this concern that people exhibit has merits because it's part of a problem that many scholars are witnessing in terms of the quality of our democracy in the end, right? Fake news can become amplified in partisan communities of like-minded people, and algorithms, particularly social media algorithms, play a big role here, right? To the degree that algorithms are trying to promote an echo chamber among its users, fake news can, in a way, be part of that problem, right? At least that's the claim made by L.A. Pariser, right? Other authors, such as Sunstein, for example, argue that misinformation cannot be understood isolated from the problem of polarization, and to the degree that polarization works against the possibility of having democratic deliberation, we should be very concerned about misinformation feeding polarization in democratic societies. The problem is that both the public and some scholars' concerns about fake news in a way contrast with the empirical evidence that these same scholars have collected on the effects of misinformation. Here I'm showing some of the data that has been collected on the problem of fake news in the United States, which, as often happens, is the country where most of the research on this subject has been conducted thus far. A famous study by Alcott and Gensko, which I'm going to come back to later on, found, for example, that during the 2016 election, on average, voters were exposed to a single piece of fabricated content, right? Some, of course, being an average, it hides some variation, and some groups were more exposed to fake news than other groups. But if the average, it's very tiny, right? This point has also been made by authors such as Greenberg and his colleagues, who found that less than 6% of all links viewed on Twitter in the United States in 2016 were from fake news sites. And even those who have been tracking the problem from 2016 onwards have found that actually, thanks to, in part because of the, because Facebook and other platforms have been tackling misinformation, actually the amount of misinformation and fake news circulating in their platforms has decreased over time. And then studies have tried to find a link between being exposed or believing in misinformation and behaviors and attitudes that are important for democracy, such as, for example, political trust and confidence in democratic institutions. When they have found effects, these are small and not very large, which in a way, again, contrasts with this idea that we're living in a post-truth era where misinformation plays a big role. It seems that these claims that make a lot of sense fall short of the empirical evidence to back them up. Ongianova and her colleagues, in a paper they published last year, they found, for example, that even when you find a negative effect of being exposed to fake news on political trust, on the levels of political trust, this effect is only manifest for a group of people, in her case, strong liberals. Actually, the inverse relationship was found for moderates and conservatives, which again goes completely against the common wisdom. All this is to say that the context suggests that concerns about misinformation abound, but empirical evidence backing up that concern in a way falls short, right? Now, Chile, which is the country where I'm located, and as many of you know, it's in South America. It's a country that, for this problem with information, it's an ideal case, right? First, because the levels of misinformation that circulates in the media ecosystem are pretty high. I'm going to show you some evidence comparing with the United States, and you will see that exposure to rumors, conspiracies, and other types of misinformation is relatively high. At the same time, people in Chile exhibit an extremely high level of trust in social media and use social media frequently to become informed. And that's completely the reverse when it comes to the mainstream media. Trust levels in mainstream media have plummeted over the past decade. And again, the use of journalistic outlets such as newspapers, radio stations, and so forth has also decreased tremendously, right? Even more than the global trends. Coupled with very low levels of political trust, makes it, again, all these elements that the literature has found that could fuel the effects of misinformation seem to be present here in this country. Now, the other important contextual information I want to give you about Chile before going to the empirical results is that in 2019, we experienced what's translated as the social uprising. In October of 2019, massive protests took place in the streets of downtown Santiago, and then they extended to the whole rest of the country. And what it meant was the largest protests against the system, the democratic capitalistic system that was in place in Chile after the military dictatorship of the 1970s and 80s, because of inequality. So in a way, by the time the pandemic hit in 2020, Chile was experiencing an uprising in terms of mobilization. And as you might guess, at times of increased mobilization, there's also times of increased supply and demand for misinformation. So for all these sorts of reasons, Chile makes it as a very good case to not only study misinformation, but actually of finding effects of misinformation on people's attitudes and behaviors. Now, the results of that I'm going to show you shortly come from two sets of studies that me and my research team here at Católica have been working on. One is a three-wave panel study that was conducted between 2017 and 2019, but before the social uprising. And then another one, study two, it's another panel study, but this with a different sample, that was conducted after the uprising of October 2019, that was wave one. And then we re-interviewed these people in the middle of the pandemic last year, in 2020. So two studies that have a similar methodology, but the context in which they took place, even though they were in similar years, it's very different. One is kind of traditional routine times in a way, and then the second study, it's between after the huge political uprising and turmoil in the country, and then the health crisis that everyone around the world knows regarding COVID-19. Now, before showing you the results, it's important to give you the conceptual and operational definition of misinformation that we are employing, because fake news is not the term we like to use. It's very politicized, and we prefer to use the term misinformation. But even misinformation is a slippery concept because it has many dimensions. In general, authors argue that misinformation involves two components. One is being exposed to, so it's the element of consumption, how familiar it's an individual user regarding a piece of a non-factual content, and also beliefs regarding one thing is to be exposed, but another one is to believe that what you are exposed actually is true. So beliefs and sorry, and exposure are two components of one thing we are going to call misinformation. Now, misinformation, again, it's a slippery concept, not only because it involves exposure and beliefs, but also because how do you define what's information and what's misinformation? How do you distinguish one from the other? And several authors are arguing that this is not something that is set in stone, right? What's true and what's not true, or what's fake, it's something that can change. It's not not always you have the most objective standard to value what's real and what's not. So what we do here is to take the idea that basically we're going to define as non-factual or misinformation claims that go against what most societally accepted evidence adjudicators establish. So, for example, in many societies, journalism, science, the justice system, and other institutions are the ones who are supposed to provide with evidence about something, either about something that happened or didn't happen. And when claims that go against what these institutions are arguing that happen, when someone spreads these claims, we say those claims are misinformation, are not factual, are not based on evidence, right? So this gives us some leeway to define that truth is not something that is set in stone, but it also depends on who's saying it, right? Now, when there's an intent to deceive by using misinformation, exposing it or circulating it, we speak of disinformation. Now, again, in a survey, it's very hard to ascertain intentions to deceive. So basically, we define that disinformation is part of a larger construct called misinformation, right? Now, how do you measure this thing? Well, we borrowed from that study I mentioned before of Alcott and Gensko on 2017, and where basically you show respondents a list of headlines, and some of these headlines are false, misinformation. Some of them are true or verified, meaning information, right? And still others are placebo, meaning they're fake fakes. So you ask them, but in a way to control people's predisposition to answer to your questions as, yes, I saw everything that you are mentioning just because they are being acquiescent rather than honest in the responses. So you, in a way, control for acquiescence by putting these placebo headlines in there, and then you control for that in the analysis. And then for each of these headlines, you ask two sets of questions. One is, if you recall being exposed to it, so that would be the measure of exposure, and then how credible you find each statement, which would be the measure of beliefs. So exposure and beliefs measured separately, and then you put them together in a measure when you track beliefs so long as they are from claims related to claims that the respondent recalls being exposed to. So someone, for example, might not have been exposed to a claim only because you're asking them in the survey, and then they say, oh yeah, I believe that's true, but you discount that because you don't want to use your survey as the one that's producing the misinformation. It's more about using the survey to measure people's recall of being exposed to misinformation. So let's move to the empirical results. Here I'm showing the data that I mentioned before, where I compared Chile as being as an ideal case study compared to other countries in terms of the misinformation problem being a big one here. And here's the data to back that claim up. When you compare the study by Alcott and Gensko conducted in the 2016 election with the first wave of the second study we did in Chile, for example, the 2019 data, you see that the Chilean numbers are way bigger than the American numbers, both in terms of exposure and in terms of beliefs regarding misinformation. So misinformation seems to be much of a larger problem here in Chile than it is in the United States. Now, you would expect, given all the background I gave you about Chile and this data, that you would find big effects, right? We're going to see that. Again, just to show you how prevalent misinformation is in Chile, here's the question measuring exposure and beliefs regarding misinformation of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So we ask our respondents in the second wave of study 2 in 2020, have they been exposed and how often they find it credible? Claims such as the coronavirus artificially was created and planned in a lab, or that the sun and high temperatures killed the coronavirus and so forth. And a sizable minority of respondents actually believe that these things are true. Now, when you combine them in an index, you see a lot of variance, but most people have been exposed and believe that at least one of these claims is true, right? Not everyone believes all of these are true, but they're spread out in the sample. Okay, so let's move on to the central part of the presentation, which is the effects of misinformation. So now you know the background of how often and how prevalent it is, and why Chile is an interesting case to study that. So here are the results of a study that it's currently under review, where we're trying to see if misinformation has an effect on one particular attitude that we think it's important in this context, which is media trust. How often people trust the news media to produce quality information that is verifiable and so forth, right? So media trust, it's an indicator of resilience against misinformation in a way, and we're trying to see if there's a relationship. Does misinformation erode media trust? Here are the results of this three-wave study summarized. So this comes from a larger statistical analysis where we predict misinformation from media trust over time, and we control for a bunch of things. And what we find is that in general, there's a lot of stability, meaning misinformation in 1 year is strongly predictive of subsequent levels of misinformation, and the same with media trust. But we don't find a lot of evidence of relationships across these two constructs. We did find that misinformation has a very tiny effect of decreasing media trust between 2017 and 2018, as you can see from these solid arrow between misinformation and media trust in 2017 and 18. But that effect doesn't replicate later on in the analysis. Between 2018 and 19, misinformation doesn't do a thing against media trust. If anything, it's actually media trust that insulates or inoculates respondents against misinformation. But even then, these relationships are very small, very tiny. And so we find no evidence of a reinforcing spiral of misinformation and media skepticism or media trust, however you wanna look at it. When we replicated this study with the second study, now the second study is not 3 waves, it's just 2 waves, so it's simpler to present the data. What we find again is that misinformation, regardless of when it was measured, even wave 1 or wave 2, doesn't do a thing in terms of predictive media trust levels. It doesn't. Other variables are more important, right? What about other types of trust? So let's forget about media trust, which we cover pretty well, and let's move to another important variable, political trust, right? Again, no significant relationship between being misinformed and trusting less political institutions. This, for example, goes against that study that I mentioned before by Ongianova in the United States. Other variables such as political ideology, for example, are much more predictive of political trust than misinformation per se. When we move to behaviors, for example, here I'm going back to study 1, for example, and where we replicate the same analysis we did for media trust, but this time with online political participation. And now we find, once again, that there are no effects. If anything, those who participated more in 2017 were actually less likely to be misinformed in 2018. And even that effect, that selective effect, dissipated by 2019. Again, the story here is a lot of stability between being misinformed and being more participatory, but not a lot of reciprocal influences between these two constructs. So again, the story here is that, so far at least, misinformation doesn't do a lot in explaining variance in political participation, in political trust, in media trust. But of course, this doesn't cover all the possible outcomes. So in study 2, this 2-wave study that I've been describing, we replicated once again the idea of comparing misinformation to participation, but we distinguish between 2 types of participation. One is protest behavior because of the uprising, and intention to vote in the 2020 referendum. As a consequence of the social uprising, the political elite, the government, and the opposition in Chile decided to hold a referendum to produce a new constitution, which was one of the big demands by protesters in 2019. So we were lucky enough to have in the field our survey. In the first wave and in the second wave, we were able to ask intentions to participate in this referendum that had been announced after the uprising of 2019. And the first thing we found was that in terms of protest behavior, in terms of misinformation fueling more protest participation in 2020, we didn't find that relationship. Now, you could argue that maybe it's the pandemic that took place in between. We leave that for discussion, but at least we found no significant relationship between misinformation and protest behavior. Again, ideological variables, for example, were much more predictive than misinformation. In terms of voting intention, though, we did find a statistically significant effect. So this time, finally, we found that there was an effect between being misinformed and being more likely to participate. But the substantive size or effect of these of misinformation again was very small. It's not that because you were misinformed now you were willing to vote or not vote. The relationship went in that direction, but the difference was around 10% in terms of probability. So not that much, right? And in the last part of the results, I'm going to show you the results of a study where using the second study where we track we forget about political outcomes because of the pandemic. It's very hard to participate in anything, right? Everyone's locked down in their homes. But we can measure, for example, attitudes towards governmental measures to contain the virus, what's called restrictive measures, right? So in Chile, as in many other countries, the government decided to implement quarantines, lockdowns, to close schools, to close businesses, and so forth, as a way of containing the virus. And of course, this became a political issue, right? Because it had a huge economic impact. So people varied in terms of how supportive they were of these restrictive measures. So with this study, with the second study, we measured support for, in the second wave, support for these containment measures. And we wanted to see whether being misinformed in wave 1 or in wave 2, which was more related to the pandemic, was it predictive or not of support for, or lack of support for these containment measures. And what we found was, again, statistically speaking, there was an effect. Those who were more misinformed about the coronavirus were less supportive of containment measures, right? And this is something that other studies, for example, in the US too, have found. But if you look again at the substantive implication of this result, not that much. I mean, those who were highly misinformed compared to those who were not misinformed, it's not much of a difference in terms of how supportive they were of containment measures, because overall, people were very supportive of these measures. Political ideology made a big difference, and the emotional aspect of the pandemic. So we measure how fearful people are of them getting the virus, or their family members or their friends. You get a scale of fear of COVID, and that was the most predictive variable per se, along with being in the right of center in terms of political ideology of containment measures. Misinformation against these two variables dwarf, right, in terms of its importance. And lastly, I mentioned that we had this experiment embedded in the second wave of study 2, where we exposed randomly a group of people to an economic goal frame, meaning news stories that highlighted the economic costs of these containment measures, compared to a group that were highlighted to the public health benefits of enacting these restrictive measures. And both of these groups compared to a control group that was not exposed whatsoever to a news story, to news stories with a frame, right? The idea for us originally was to see whether goal framing made a difference in terms of policy preferences. Our expectation was that those exposed to an economic goal will support less containment measures or restrictive measures, compared to those who were exposed to a public health goal that were going to increase their support. And here I'm showing a subset of that analysis where I compare goal framing effects on restrictive measures, but distinguishing between those who were highly misinformed with those who were not really misinformed. And as you can see, the only instance where misinformation made a difference was for the economic goal frame. And specifically, those who were at the maximum level of misinformation, actually, when they were exposed to an economic goal frame, they reduced significantly their support for restrictive measures. If they were not in that category, regardless of the frame they were exposed, there was no difference. But even that highly misinformed group of respondents that for whom the economic goal frame resonated, it wasn't that misinformation making a huge impact, right? Even if it was statistically significant, on average, it was less than 10% of a difference between supporting or not supporting these containment measures, such as the quarantines, the lockdowns, and the closures. So can we say that misinformation exacerbates news framing effects? Yeah, it does, but tiny, right? A tiny effect. So to conclude, after all this long voyage on results of these studies on the effects of misinformation, it's hard to conclude that misinformation is a concern or a big concern. It's hard to conclude. I mean, just the evidence, it points actually to the other direction, that it's kind of a non-problem or a very small problem, right? And again, in our perspective, we're conducting these studies in a context that should be very favorable to finding big effects, and we just don't find them, right? So we kind of share Andy Guess's and his colleagues' conclusion in a piece they published in 2019, that when it comes to describing the magnitude of the misinformation problem, they were describing the American case, they concluded that it's less than you think. And we kind of, our results echo that feeling that in a way, everyone's concerned about misinformation. We are in the first place as scholars doing this work. But once you collect the evidence and you analyze it, it's hard to conclude that misinformation is so big of a problem as people often think. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep on studying misinformation. For one thing, our studies, for example, have a number of limitations. They are not experimental evidence per se. We use surveys that maybe are not the best method to measure this problem. Our multi-wave panel studies, although they're very good in terms of allowing us to track the temporal order of the variables and the influences, but maybe the lags are too long, and maybe the effects are very strong, but only in the immediate or in the short term, and maybe our studies are missing that. But regardless of all these limitations, we do think that we still need to do more work, but at least we are not seeing, and this is something, again, that kind of other research conducted elsewhere has found too, we're not seeing the big negative effects that everyone was expecting, or at least we were expecting that we're going to find. And with that, I finish. Thank you very much for your time and your patience.